Captain Dana Wells had always been someone who could command a room. From the very first day she donned the police uniform, she knew the challenges she would face. Being both a black woman and a police officer had presented unique trials throughout her career, but she had weathered them with strength, determination, and grace. Over the years, she had risen through the ranks not by playing politics or pulling strings, but by proving her competence, grit, and intelligence. Now, as a respected captain, she often had to remind herself of how far she'd come. Today, however, she wasn't wearing her uniform. She was just Dana Wells, an off-duty officer trying to enjoy a rare evening of normalcy. It was nearing dusk, and the sky outside was painted with hues of purple and orange. Dana loved this time of day, when the city seemed to exhale, transitioning from the chaos of day into the calm of evening. She had spent the last hour in a grocery store, a relatively mundane task, but one that she appreciated. It was a brief escape from the relentless pressure of her job. The small hum of the grocery store, the quiet banter between customers and cashiers, provided a welcome background to the thoughts swirling in her mind. She picked up a loaf of fresh sourdough bread from a local bakery and placed it into her basket, already thinking about the dinner she had planned for later that evening. In casual jeans and a simple gray sweatshirt, she moved with ease through the aisles, invisible to the world. Her badge and gun were safely tucked away in her purse, concealed beneath her arm. Though her job never really left her, Dana found comfort in moments like these, moments where she could blend into the crowd, just another face in a sea of people. After paying for her groceries, she walked toward the exit of the store, the cool air greeting her as the automatic doors slid open. The street outside was busy, but not overwhelmingly so. A couple of cyclists zoomed past her, and a group of teenagers laughed loudly as they walked by, animated in conversation. Dana smiled to herself, momentarily lost in the simple joy of the world around her. She slung her grocery bag over her shoulder and began the short walk back to her apartment. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A message from her partner asking when she'd be home. Dana quickly tapped a response. "On my way now. Just grabbing groceries. See you in 10. It was a routine day. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. About 2 blocks away, Officer Greg Mathers sat in his squad car, restless. The day had been uneventful so far, with only minor incidents. A traffic stop here, a noise complaint there. As an officer who prided himself on taking action, Greg found the quietness unnerving. He had joined the force to make a difference, to be in the middle of the action. He was still relatively young in his career, but his confidence in his abilities often led him to act on instinct. Sometimes those instincts were sharp, but other times they were clouded by assumptions he wasn't even fully aware of. The radio crackled to life. "Dispatch to all units, we have a 1031 in progress. Robbery suspect, black female, mid-30s, wearing dark jeans and a gray sweatshirt, last seen heading west on 5th and Maple." The dispatcher's voice was calm but urgent. Greg's eyes sharpened and he straightened up in his seat, adrenaline surging. "Unit 34, copy that," he responded quickly into the radio. "Heading toward 5th and Maple now." His heart raced and his hands tightened around the steering wheel. A robbery suspect fleeing the scene. This was exactly the kind of situation he'd been waiting for. His mind raced as he replayed the dispatch call in his head. Black female, mid-30s, dark jeans, gray sweatshirt. He could already feel the excitement of catching the suspect, of playing the role of the hero on tonight's shift. He made a sharp turn down Maple, scanning the streets for anyone who might match the description. And then he saw her. Dana Wells was casually walking down the street, a bag of groceries in her hand, her pace leisurely. She was minding her own business, completely unaware of the squad car that was slowly creeping up behind her. From Greg's perspective, it all made sense. She matched the description perfectly. Mid-30s, black, gray sweatshirt, dark jeans. He didn't give it a second thought. Greg's pulse quickened. His instincts screamed at him to act fast. He pulled over to the side of the road, his eyes never leaving the woman as she continued to walk, unaware of the tension building behind her. "Ma'am, stop right there." Greg's voice rang out loud and authoritative, echoing off the buildings surrounding them. Dana stopped in her tracks, confused. The words hadn't quite registered yet. She turned around slowly, blinking against the bright headlights of the police cruiser, which now felt like two spotlights beaming directly at her. Her first instinct was that there must be some mistake. She had done nothing wrong. This had to be a misunderstanding. But the officer's posture, the tone of his voice, it all suggested something far more serious than a simple mix-up. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked calmly, though there was a slight edge to her voice. Dana had been in situations like this before, not personally, but as an officer responding to scenes. Her experience told her that staying calm, maintaining control over her voice and body language, was key to diffusing tension. But Greg wasn't listening to her words. His mind was already made up. His pulse throbbed in his ears as he stepped closer, his hand resting on the grip of his holstered gun. The description from dispatch echoed in his mind, and the scene before him matched perfectly. "Hands where I can see them," he barked, his voice sharp, his stance tense and ready for action. Dana frowned, the confusion deepening. She had dealt with tense situations before, but never one where she was the subject of suspicion. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding," she began, her voice still controlled, still trying to make sense of what was happening. But Greg wasn't hearing her. His eyes were locked on her, watching her every movement. His training kicked in, the voice in his head telling him to remain in control, to assume the worst-case scenario. He had made countless arrests before, many of them in situations just like this. His grip tightened on his holstered weapon as he repeated his command. "I said hands where I can see them, now." Dana's heartbeat quickened. She could feel the tension radiating off him, could sense the situation spiraling out of control. "I'm a police officer," she said, the firmness in her voice growing. "I'm Captain Dana Wells from the 4th Precinct." But Greg was already too far gone. His perception had been clouded by the description, by his own preconceived notions of what danger looked like. In his mind, this was a suspect trying to lie her way out of an arrest. It was a story he had heard many times before, people pretending to be someone they weren't, claiming innocence when they weren't. "Yeah, right," he muttered, barely processing her words as his hand moved toward his handcuffs. Before Dana could react, Greg was on her, grabbing her arm and spinning her around with a force that startled her. Her purse fell to the ground, her groceries spilling across the sidewalk as he roughly pulled her hands behind her back. The cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, sending a surge of shock and anger through her. "Officer, this is a mistake," she protested, her voice rising in frustration as she struggled against the cuffs. "My badge is in my purse. I am Captain Dana Wells. You've got the wrong person." But Greg's tunnel vision had already kicked in. He was going through the motions of what he believed to be a standard arrest, following protocol. In his mind, he had no time for excuses, no patience for what he thought were lies. With a firm grip on her arm, he led her toward the back of his squad car, ignoring the scattered groceries on the sidewalk, ignoring the anger building in her voice. Dana's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. How could this be happening? How could one of her own officers be treating her like this? She had spent years working alongside men like Greg, building trust, fostering camaraderie within the department, and yet in this moment, none of that seemed to matter. She was just another black woman in handcuffs, her identity, her rank, her years of service reduced to nothing. As Greg pushed her into the back seat of his squad car, the world around them seemed to pause. People on the street had begun to notice, some pulling out their phones to record the scene unfolding before them. To them, it looked like yet another arrest of a black woman by a white cop, a scene that had played out too many times in recent years, one that never failed to stir outrage and debate. Dana could feel their eyes on her, could feel the humiliation burning in her chest. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something much larger, something much more painful and real. Greg closed the door, his mind already on autopilot, convinced that he had done his job. that he had apprehended a suspect, that justice had been served. He quickly radioed into the precinct. "Suspect in custody," he said, his voice calm, confident. "Bringing her in now." As he pulled away from the curb, the sirens wailing faintly in the distance, Dana sat in the back seat, her hands cuffed behind her, staring out of the window. The city lights blurred past her as she felt the weight of the moment sink deeper into her bones. This was more than just a mistake. This was an indictment of everything she had fought for, of everything she had believed in. The system had failed her, just as it had failed so many others before her. And what came next would change everything. Dana Wells sat in the cramped holding cell, the cold steel of the bench beneath her only serving to heighten her sense of disbelief. How had it come to this? How had she, a captain in the very police department, she had devoted her life to law enforcement, only to end up in a situation like this? The quiet hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their harsh glow making the room feel even more sterile and unwelcoming. The dull gray cinderblock walls seemed to close in on her, reflecting the emotions swirling inside her mind. Her hands, which had been cuffed until just moments before, now rested in her lap. Her wrists were still sore from the tightness of the restraints, and she massaged them absent-mindedly, though her thoughts were far from her physical discomfort. Her mind replayed the scene from the street over and over like a broken record, refusing to stop. The moment Officer Greg Mathers had pulled her over, how he had disregarded her words, her identity, how he had ignored the truth staring him right in the face. Captain Dana Wells, a woman who had given over a decade of her life to law enforcement, who had worked tirelessly to bring fairness and equity to the department, who had climbed through the ranks despite every obstacle thrown her way. And now, after all that, she sat here, humiliated, her authority stripped from her by the very system she had sworn to protect and improve. The holding area was mostly empty, save for a few officers passing by from time to time. Their eyes flickered toward her in confusion, perhaps with a hint of pity, but no one spoke to her directly. There was an awkward tension in the air, a sense that something deeply wrong had happened, yet no one knew exactly how to address it. Dana's pulse was still racing, though she forced herself to remain calm. She knew she couldn't afford to lose her composure, not now. The anger simmering beneath her calm exterior was like a storm waiting to break, but she tamped it down with every breath. This wasn't the time to explode. No, she needed to think, to figure out what came next. She was the one always in control, always level-headed in the face of chaos, and she couldn't afford to be anything less now, even if it was her dignity that had been so callously trampled. The door to the precinct's intake room opened with a sudden creak, and Sergeant Maria Lopez strolled in, her expression a mix of concern and disbelief. Dana watched as Lopez scanned the room, her eyes widening slightly as she spotted Dana behind the bars. For a moment, Lopez hesitated, her hand hovering over the door handle as if she needed to collect herself before confronting the reality of what had happened. "Captain Wells?" Lopez's voice was soft, almost hesitant. "What in the world is going on?" Dana stood, brushing off the front of her sweatshirt, though her actions were more out of habit than necessity. "You tell me, Sergeant," she replied coolly, though the edge in her voice was undeniable. "One of your officers just arrested me, Officer Mathers. Apparently, I fit the description of a robbery suspect." Lopez's face went pale. She quickly fumbled with the keys on her belt, unlocking the door to the holding cell and stepping inside. I had no idea. This has to be a mistake." "It is," Dana said, her voice firm but restrained. "But it's more than just a mistake, Maria. It's a failure of judgment, a failure of training. And right now it's making this department look like a complete joke." Lopez bit her lip, her eyes darting toward the door as if she expected someone else to walk in and magically fix the situation. "I'm so sorry, Captain. Let me get you out of here and I'll handle this immediately." Dana didn't argue. She stepped out of the holding cell, her back straight, her face a mask of composure. As they walked down the hallway toward her office, Dana's mind continued to whirl. The precinct was quieter than usual, the officers still at their desks, seeming to sense that something was off, but no one said anything as they passed. They reached Dana's office, and Lopez quickly closed the door behind them, her face still flushed with embarrassment and discomfort. "Captain, I swear, we had no idea it was you. Officer Mathers. I don't even think he knows yet. He's filing the report now." Dana raised an eyebrow, her gaze sharp. "He doesn't know yet after all this time?" Lopez swallowed hard. I don't think he recognized you, Captain. He thought he was following protocol. There was a description, a suspect, and he acted. It was only after you were brought in that anyone realized who you are." Dana sat behind her desk, her hands resting on the surface, though she resisted the urge to slam her fist against it. "He didn't even bother to listen when I told him who I was," she said, her voice colder now. "That's the problem, Maria. It's not just about mistaken identity. It's about the fact that he looked at me and saw a criminal. He saw a black woman in a sweatshirt and jeans and decided that was enough." Lopez winced, knowing the truth in those words. "I'll make sure Officer Mathers is aware of the mistake, Captain. I'll get him in here to apologize immediately." Dana narrowed her eyes. "This isn't about an apology, Sergeant. This is about a systemic issue. This is about bias, prejudice, things we've been trying to root out for years, and yet, here we are." Lopez nodded, looking chastened. "I understand, Captain. I'll start the internal review process. This will be investigated thoroughly." Dana sighed, leaning back in her chair as the exhaustion she had been holding at bay finally began to seep into her bones. "Good. But this doesn't end with just an investigation, Maria. This needs to be a wake-up call for the entire department. What happened to me is just one example of a much larger problem." As Lopez nodded, her expression serious, the door to Dana's office swung open without warning, and in stepped Officer Greg Mathers. His face was pale, his eyes wide with confusion and horror. He had finally been told. "Captain Wells," he stammered, his voice shaking slightly. I didn't know. I swear, I didn't realize it was you." Dana turned her chair to face him fully, her expression unreadable. For a moment she said nothing, simply letting the weight of the situation settle over him. She could see the fear and guilt written all over his face, and while part of her wanted to let him off easy, to chalk this up to a simple mistake, she knew that wasn't the right thing to do. "Officer Mathers," she began, her voice calm but unyielding. "You arrested me without even bothering to check my identification. I told you multiple times who I was, and you ignored me. You assumed that because I matched a vague description I was guilty." Greg's eyes flickered with panic. "Captain, I was just following the description from dispatch. You fit it perfectly, and I thought I was doing the right thing." Dana's jaw tightened. "The right thing?" She let out a slow breath, keeping her voice steady. "The right thing would have been to take a moment and listen to me. The right thing would have been to ask for identification before slapping handcuffs on someone, but instead you saw what you wanted to see." Greg's mouth opened and closed as if he was struggling to find the right words, but none came. His face flushed with shame, his hands twitching nervously at his sides. "I'm sorry, Captain, I really am. I never meant to disrespect you. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." "I'm sure you didn't," Dana said, her voice softening just a fraction. "But what you meant doesn't change what you did. This isn't just about me, Officer Mathers. This is about how we as police officers interact with the people we are supposed to protect. If you couldn't listen to me, your captain, when I told you who I was, what does that say about how you treat the civilians we encounter every day?" Greg blinked, his expression slowly shifting from defensive to reflective. The weight of Dana's words was sinking in, and he could feel the magnitude of his mistake more fully now. He had been so certain, so sure that he was acting correctly in the moment. But now, faced with the reality of what he had done, he realized how wrong he had been. Dana didn't let him off the hook just yet. "You didn't see a person, Greg. You saw a threat and you reacted based on that assumption without stopping to question it. That's a problem, and it's not just your problem. It's a problem throughout this department and, frankly, across the entire police force. Greg stood there, silent, his face downcast. He had no words of defense left. He had nothing to say that could change what had happened. Lopez, sensing the gravity of the moment, stepped forward. "Captain, I'll make sure Officer Mathers undergoes a full review, and I'll be recommending further training for all of our officers regarding racial bias and appropriate procedures." Dana nodded, though her mind was already moving forward, thinking about the broader implications of what had happened. Good, but it's not just about training. We need to start holding people accountable for these mistakes, and we need to do more than just pay lip service to the idea of reform. Otherwise, we're just going to keep finding ourselves in the same situation over and over again. Greg nodded slowly, his face still pale as if he was just beginning to understand the full scope of what Dana had been saying. Dana leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "Officer Mathers, I expect better from you. I expect better from all of us, do you understand that?" He swallowed hard and nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, Captain, I do." With that, Dana dismissed him with a wave of her hand, and Greg quietly left the office, still visibly shaken. Sergeant Lopez remained, her posture tense. "Captain, I'm truly sorry this happened. We'll fix this, I promise." Dana nodded, though the heaviness in her heart remained. "Make sure we do, Maria. Make sure we do." The news spread through the precinct like wildfire, faster than anyone could have anticipated. By the time Dana Wells had left her office, the weight of the day's events was already rippling through the department, casting a long shadow over everything she and her team had worked to build. Dana felt the weight of the stairs as she walked through the precinct. The once familiar corridors now seemed heavy with whispers and judgment. Officers who had been casually filing reports or chatting fell silent, eyes trailing her every step. Conversations halted mid-sentence, replaced by murmurs and furtive glances. The incident, the arrest, was already the talk of the department. It was the kind of attention she never wanted. This wasn't the spotlight that came with accolades or breaking a major case. It was the uncomfortable mix of disbelief, pity, and gossip. Dana knew the looks, some shocked, some curious, others maybe even suspicious. Captain Dana Wells, a respected leader who had earned her place at the top, had been handcuffed by her own officer, and the news was spreading like wildfire. She kept her head high, walking with purpose, but the simmering humiliation was harder to ignore. The precinct felt alien now, like a place where the invisible fractures of bias and mistrust had surfaced, making her question whether she truly belonged anymore. The voices in the background were hard to drown out. "Did you hear? Mathers arrested Captain Wells." "Captain Wells? No way, that's a disaster waiting to happen." "Man, he's done, they're going to fire him for sure." Dana blocked out the chatter, her focus set on something bigger than her own embarrassment. What had happened to her wasn't just a personal indignity, it was a reflection of a deeper problem, one that stretched far beyond the precinct's walls. A systemic issue, embedded in the very structure of law enforcement. When she finally stepped outside, the cool evening air slapped her awake. The murmur of distant traffic echoed faintly, a stark contrast to the turmoil swirling in her mind. She paused at the top of the precinct steps, scanning the street. This building, once her second home, felt unfamiliar. It no longer offered the comfort of belonging or the certainty of purpose. After what had happened, the walls of the precinct felt more like barriers than protective confines. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from her partner. "Are you okay?" Dana stared at the screen, her thumb hesitating over the keys. She hadn't had a chance to explain everything that had unfolded, and honestly, she wasn't sure she was ready to. How could she possibly convey the humiliation, the shock, the anger of being arrested by her own officer, someone she had trusted to uphold the standards of the job? She typed back a simple, non-committal response. "I'm fine. I'll be home soon. Long day." As she slid the phone back into her pocket, She noticed movement down the street. A small group had gathered at the corner, their faces bathed in the glow of their phones. It took a moment for the realization to hit her. They were recording her. Dana's breath caught in her throat as she pieced it together. The arrest had already made its way online. Videos had surfaced, captured by bystanders, and now it was spreading like wildfire. She could see the flashes of phones, people holding them up, recording her as if she were some kind of spectacle. A fresh wave of frustration coursed through her. The incident, which she hadn't even fully processed herself, was no longer hers to control. The narrative was already in the hands of strangers, people who didn't know her, who would shape the story through the lens of their own biases and assumptions. She could almost hear the sensational headlines forming in real time. Black female police captain, wrongly arrested by white officer. It was a story that fit too perfectly into the larger, painful narrative of racial bias in policing. Dana hated that. Hated the thought of becoming part of that broader story, of her name being added to a list of injustices. She wasn't just another case, she was a person, a leader, someone who had worked relentlessly to bring change from within. And now she was a symbol. Dana knew this was bigger than just her. Her mind raced, thinking about how the department would handle the situation. The chief had already called earlier, leaving a voicemail that was equal parts apologetic and panicked. "We'll handle this, Dana," he had said. "We can't let this get out of hand. Let's not make a big deal out of it. We need to be united on this." But Dana wasn't sure she agreed. Letting this go, sweeping it under the rug, wasn't going to solve anything. If she didn't speak out, if she didn't demand accountability, what message would that send to the rest of the department, to the community she served? The image of her being handcuffed on the street was now public, a symbol of the very thing she had fought against her entire career: unconscious bias, racial profiling, and the systemic flaws within policing. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden vibration in her pocket. Another message, this time from the department's PR office. It was short and to the point. "We need to talk about the press. Call me ASAP." Dana clenched her jaw, her frustration mounting. The press, of course, this was where it was headed. The department would want to control the narrative, to spin it in a way that minimized damage. She could already see it. Vague statements about mistakes and unfortunate misunderstandings. The kind of language that smoothed over rough edges without addressing the root of the problem. She sighed heavily, her breath visible in the cool air. There would be no easy way out of this, no simple fix. The protests would come next. She was certain of it. The video of her arrest would fuel outrage. Not just from those who already distrusted the police, but from people who had once believed in the system. People who had looked up to her as a symbol of progress. Dana knew she represented something bigger to a lot of people. Her rise through the ranks had been seen as a victory, a sign that things were changing, that the police could evolve into something better. But now, this incident threatened to unravel all of that. As she descended the steps, she saw the reporters gathered at the edge of the sidewalk, just beyond the hastily set-up barricades meant to keep the public at bay. Cameras clicked and flashed, and microphones were thrust forward as Dana approached. Questions were shouted in rapid succession. "Captain Wells, do you have any comment on your wrongful arrest? Do you believe this was racially motivated? What does this incident say about the state of the department?" Dana stopped short, her body tense as she considered her next move. She hadn't expected the press to descend on her so quickly, but she should have known better. They were hungry for a story, and this one was juicy. She could see the headlines already forming in their minds, the clicks and views they would generate. It was tempting to give them what they wanted, to stand in front of the cameras and lay bare the truth about what had happened. But she knew a single word out of place could inflame the situation even further. A tap on her shoulder snapped her out of her thoughts. She turned to see Sergeant Lopez hurrying toward her, her expression strained. "Captain, we've got to get you inside. This is blowing up fast." Dana nodded curtly, her eyes still fixed on the cameras and reporters. but she allowed Lopez to guide her back inside the precinct. The press, undeterred, continued shouting questions at her retreating figure, their voices fading only as the doors swung shut behind her. Inside, Lopez turned to face Dana, her hands fidgeting nervously. The chief's in a meeting with the mayor. They're scrambling to figure out how to handle this, and, there's already a protest starting outside. Of course there is, Dana muttered, rubbing her temple as the tension continued to build. This had always been inevitable. Lopez hesitated, then nodded. They're worried. The higher-ups, I mean. They're afraid this could turn into a full-blown scandal. There's talk about releasing a statement soon, but they want your input first. Dana felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. My input? Now they want my input? After I've already been humiliated in front of the entire department? After I've been made an example of exactly what's wrong with this place? Lopez shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of how to respond. Captain, they're just trying to keep things from spiraling out of control. Dana's eyes narrowed. Maybe things need to spiral out of control. Maybe that's the only way anything's going to change. For a moment, the two women stood in tense silence, the weight of the situation hanging between them. Finally, Lopez spoke again, her voice quieter this time. Look, Dana, I get it. What happened to you it's messed up. But the chief's trying to avoid this turning into something we can't handle. He wants to keep the peace. Dana snorted. Peace? There's no peace to keep. This department has been walking on a powder keg for years, and we all know it. I'm not interested in keeping the peace, Maria. I'm interested in fixing the problem. Lopez swallowed, her gaze flitting toward the door as if she were expecting someone else to step in and take over the conversation. So what do you want to do then? Dana didn't hesitate. I want accountability. I want a public admission of what went wrong, and I want Officer Mathers and anyone else involved to face consequences. Real consequences, not just a slap on the wrist. Lopez nodded slowly, though the worry in her eyes remained. I'll pass that along to the chief, but you know this isn't going to be easy, right? There are people higher up who won't want this to turn into a bigger issue than it already is. Dana straightened her posture, her voice firm. It's already a big issue, Maria, and it's not going away. With that, she turned and headed down the hallway, leaving Lopez standing there, unsure of what to do next. Dana knew that what lay ahead would be difficult, that there would be pushback from all sides. But she was ready. She had fought too long and too hard to let this be swept under the rug. If the department didn't want to face the truth, then she would force them to, no matter the cost. Greg Mathers sat in the locker room, his back pressed against the cold metal of the lockers, his head buried in his hands. The noise of his fellow officers moving about the precinct, filing reports, answering phones, responding to dispatches, felt distant, muffled, like a far-off hum that barely registered in his mind. The silence in his head, however, was deafening. He had replayed the moment over and over again, trying to understand how things had gone so wrong. He had been so sure in those crucial few minutes on the street. His training had kicked in, and every instinct he'd honed over the years told him he was making the right call. The suspect fit the description perfectly. Black female, gray sweatshirt, dark jeans. That was all he needed. His mind hadn't even entertained the possibility that the woman in front of him could be someone else, let alone his captain. How could he have missed that? How could he have failed so spectacularly? The realization hit him harder each time he thought about it. He had arrested his own captain, someone who outranked him, who had years more experience than he did, someone whose leadership was highly respected in the department, and not just any officer, Dana Wells, a captain known for her fairness, her competence, and her determination to reform the police department from within. Greg lifted his head slightly and stared down at his hands. They were shaking, whether from adrenaline or nerves, he wasn't sure. But he couldn't seem to make them stop. He felt sick, like there was a weight pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. The locker room, usually a place where officers joked and decompressed after a shift, now felt suffocating, as if the air itself had turned against him. The door to the locker room swung open, and Greg tensed instinctively, his eyes darting toward the entrance. Sergeant Lopez entered, her face set in a grim expression. Greg had seen her like this before. No nonsense, focused, the kind of expression that usually preceded bad news. "Mathers," Lopez said, her voice low and tight. "We need to talk." Greg swallowed hard and stood up, his legs feeling weak beneath him. He wasn't sure if he was ready for whatever conversation was about to happen, but he had no choice. Lopez gestured for him to follow her, and he did so in silence, his heart pounding in his chest. They walked down the hallway, past the bullpen where officers were busy with paperwork and responding to calls. A few of them glanced at Greg as he passed, but none of them said anything. The silence felt worse than any words they could have thrown at him. Greg knew that the entire precinct had heard by now. Everyone knew what had happened. His mistake had become the defining story of the day. Lopez led him to a small conference room and closed the door behind them. The room was sparsely furnished, just a table and a few chairs. But the atmosphere felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Greg took a seat at the table, his hands resting on his knees, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Lopez remained standing, arms crossed, her gaze fixed on him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The tension in the room was thick, and Greg could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, making the silence almost unbearable. Finally, Lopez spoke, her voice calm but with an unmistakable edge of frustration. "Do you have any idea how bad this looks?" she asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. Greg's throat felt dry and he struggled to find his voice. I know, Sergeant. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Lopez let out a sharp breath, her hands dropping to her sides. "Whether you meant for it to happen or not doesn't change the fact that it did. You arrested Captain Wells, one of our own, a captain. Greg, do you understand the gravity of that?" Greg nodded, though the gesture felt hollow. "I thought I was following protocol. The description matched. I thought I had the right suspect. The description matched." Greg's voice wavered, trying to sound confident but faltering under the weight of his own doubt. Lopez's eyes narrowed, incredulous. "Is that all it takes? A vague description and you immediately assume guilt? You didn't even stop to check her identification, did you?" Greg's face flushed with shame. "No, I didn't. I thought she was trying to, I don't know, talk her way out of it. I've seen people do it before." Lopez's expression hardened. "Talk her way out of it? She told you she was Captain Wells. You didn't listen. You didn't even consider the possibility that she was telling the truth." Greg dropped his gaze to the table, unable to meet her eyes. His mind was spinning, filled with regret, but he didn't know how to fix what he had broken. How could he? There was no going back, no undoing the arrest, no erasing the humiliation he had caused. Lopez pulled out a chair and sat down across from him, leaning forward slightly. "Greg, this isn't just about you making a mistake. This is about the fact that you saw a black woman in a sweatshirt and immediately thought she was guilty. You didn't question it. You didn't hesitate. You acted on instinct, and your instincts were wrong." Greg winced at her words. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, someone who followed the rules, someone who did the right thing. But now, he was being forced to confront the fact that his instincts, his judgment had been shaped by something much darker, something he didn't want to admit. "I didn't mean to," he began, but Lopez cut him off. "I know you didn't mean to, Greg, but that's the problem. It's not about your intentions, it's about the impact of your actions. And the impact here is huge. Captain Wells is one of the most respected officers in this department, and you treated her like a criminal. Do you have any idea what kind of message that sends?" Greg shook his head, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. "I didn't think," he muttered, trailing off. "No, you didn't," Lopez said sharply. "And now we're all going to have to deal with the fallout." The words stung, but Greg knew she was right. This wasn't just about him anymore. His actions had affected the entire department, and the repercussions were only just beginning. Lopez sighed, leaning back in her chair. The video of the arrest is already all over social media. It's gone viral. There are protests forming outside the precinct right now. People are angry and they have every right to be. This isn't just a PR nightmare, Greg. This is a crisis. Greg's heart sank even further. He had known the video would surface eventually. There had been people on the street recording the arrest, but he hadn't realized how quickly it would spread. The thought of millions of people watching the footage, seeing his mistake in real time, made his stomach churn. "What's going to happen now?" he asked, his voice small. Lopez looked at him for a long moment before answering. "The chief is in a meeting with the mayor. They're trying to figure out how to handle this, but it's not looking good. There's talk about you being suspended, maybe even terminated." Greg felt the blood drain from his face. Terminated? The thought hadn't even crossed his mind until now, but it made sense. This wasn't the kind of mistake you could recover from easily. He had arrested a captain, his own captain, and now the entire department was in damage control mode. Lopez watched him, her expression softening slightly. "Look, Greg, I know you didn't mean for any of this to happen, but this is bigger than you now. The department is going to have to make a statement, and they need to show that they're taking this seriously. That means there's going to be consequences, whether you like it or not." Greg nodded slowly, though his mind was still reeling from the possibility of losing his job. He had worked so hard to get here, had put in the hours, the effort, the training, and now, because of one moment of poor judgment, it could all be gone. "I understand," he said quietly, though the words felt hollow. Lopez stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. "For what it's worth, Greg, I don't think you're a bad cop, but you need to start thinking more carefully about how you do your job. There's a lot more at stake here than just catching suspects. You've got to think about how your actions affect people, how they reflect on the department. If you can't do that, then maybe this isn't the right place for you." Her words hung in the air, and Greg felt them pierce through him like a knife. He had never thought of himself as anything less than a good cop, someone who was dedicated to the job. But now, for the first time, he was forced to confront the possibility that maybe he wasn't as good as he thought he was. Maybe his instincts weren't as reliable as he'd believed. Maybe he had a lot more to learn. Lopez left the room, leaving Greg alone with his thoughts. He sat there in silence, staring at the table in front of him, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Guilt, shame, fear, confusion. The weight of what had happened pressed down on him, and he wasn't sure if he'd ever be able to shake it off. As the minutes ticked by, Greg thought about what Lopez had said, about the protests outside, about the video that was now circulating online. His actions had caused a firestorm, one that wouldn't be easily extinguished. He could feel his future slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He stood up slowly, his legs shaky beneath him, and left the conference room. As he walked down the hallway, the familiar sights and sounds of the precinct felt foreign, distant, like he was walking through someone else's life. He passed a few officers, their eyes flicking toward him with a mixture of sympathy and judgment, but no one said anything. Greg stepped outside into the cool evening air, the sounds of the protest hitting him like a wave. The voices were louder now, filled with anger and determination. Signs waved in the air, the chants echoing off the buildings around him. "Justice for Captain Wells. No more police brutality. Hold them accountable." Greg stood frozen on the steps of the precinct, watching the scene unfold before him. His heart pounded in his chest. He had always been the one behind the badge, the protector, the one people looked to for safety. But now, standing there, he felt like the enemy. The eyes of the crowd, filled with rage and hurt, seemed to bore into him, accusing him of a betrayal far deeper than his own mistake. His career, his reputation, his future, they all felt uncertain now, slipping through his grasp like water. In that moment, Greg Mathers finally understood how deep the problem really went. This wasn't just about him, or even about Captain Wells. It was about something much larger, about a system that had been failing people for too long. Dana Wells sat in her office, the door closed against the noise of the precinct outside. The dim light from her desk lamp cast long shadows on the walls, giving the room an eerie stillness. She had been sitting there for what felt like hours, staring at a blank report on her computer. The cursor blinked, waiting for her to type something, but her mind couldn't focus. The adrenaline from the arrest had long faded, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion. Her body ached from the tension she'd been holding in since the moment Greg Mathers had slapped handcuffs on her wrists. The humiliation she had tried to bury now lingered, heavy and bitter. No matter how many times she replayed the scene in her mind, she couldn't shake the sting of betrayal. Dana had spent her entire career fighting for the respect and trust of her peers. As a black woman in law enforcement, she had always known she had to be twice as good, twice as tough, just to be seen as equal. She had worked her way up, step by grueling step, from patrol officer to detective, from detective to sergeant, and finally captain. Yet despite all of her accomplishments, despite the reforms she had championed, one of her own officers had arrested her without hesitation, without recognition, without even questioning his own assumptions. She clenched her jaw, staring up at the ceiling. The department had always been her second home. She had poured her heart and soul into this place, believing she could make a difference from the inside. She had seen the systemic issues, the biases, the unfair treatment, especially against people of color, and had worked tirelessly to change things. She had pushed for diversity training, implemented policies to address racial profiling, and advocated for community policing efforts to rebuild trust. And yet, after all that, she had ended up in the back of a squad car, handcuffed like a criminal. Her phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. A text from her partner, Emma. "How are you holding up? Everyone's talking about it at the station. Call me if you need to talk." Dana sighed. Emma, a firefighter at a station across town, was one of the few people who truly understood the weight of her job, even if their worlds were different. The culture at Emma's station was tight-knit, more supportive, like a family. It was a dynamic Dana sometimes envied but never voiced aloud. She wanted to text back, to reassure Emma that she was fine, that she could handle this. But the truth was, Dana wasn't sure if she was fine. This wasn't something she could just push aside, something she could shrug off and move on from. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," Dana called, quickly sitting up straighter and pushing her emotions down. The door opened, and Chief Henry Marshall stepped inside. He was an imposing man, tall and broad-shouldered, his once dark hair now streaked with gray. His uniform was immaculate, as always, the gold stars on his collar gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Dana had always respected him, even when they didn't see eye to eye on policy. He was old school in many ways, but he had supported her push for reforms, and she appreciated that. But today, his expression was different, heavier, more guarded. "Dana," he began, his voice low and somber. "We need to talk." Dana motioned for him to sit. The chief closed the door behind him before taking a seat across from her desk. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension, and Dana could sense that whatever this conversation was, it wasn't going to be easy. "I'm sure you know why I'm here," Marshall finally said, meeting her eyes. Dana nodded slowly. "I figured." He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "Look, Dana, you know I have a lot of respect for you. I've watched you rise through the ranks, and I've seen the positive impact you've had on this department. But what happened yesterday? Well, it's caused a lot of problems." Dana's stomach tightened, but she kept her face neutral. "I'm aware. The protests are still going on outside." Marshall sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yes, and they're not getting any smaller. The press is all over this, and the mayor, well, let's just say he's not happy. He's worried about how this is going to affect public trust in the department." Public trust, Dana thought bitterly. The irony was almost too much to bear. public trust had been eroded long before this incident, and not just because of one mistake by a single officer. It was because of years of systemic issues, years of people in power refusing to address the root causes of the mistrust between the police and the community. Public trust? She said, unable to keep the edge out of her voice. That's what the mayor's worried about? Marshall exhaled slowly, his gaze steady. This incident has exposed a lot, Dana. And now, we're all in the spotlight. Chief Dana kept her voice steady, though her words carried weight. This isn't just about one mistake. What happened yesterday is part of a much bigger problem we've been ignoring for too long. Marshall's gaze sharpened. For a fleeting moment, Dana saw the weariness in his eyes. Decades in law enforcement had exposed him to scandals, corruption, and countless missteps. Yet, this time was different, and she knew he felt it too. This wasn't just another public relations nightmare. It was about the very fabric of the department starting to fray. I know, Marshall admitted quietly, his voice burdened with a weight he had long carried. You think I don't see it? You think I haven't tried to fix it? The truth is, Dana, the department is a machine, and machines don't change overnight. We've been patching up leaks for years, but every time we fix one, another one springs open. It's a constant battle. Dana leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of her desk with determination. I understand that, Chief. But we can't keep acting like this is just business as usual. We can't sweep this under the rug and hope it goes away. I'm not saying we should, Marshall replied, his tone firmer now. But we have to be smart about how we handle this. The mayor is already talking about launching an independent investigation into the incident, and I won't lie to you, Dana. Officer Ma might lose his job over this. Dana's stomach tightened at the mention of Greg Ma. She hadn't expected to feel conflicted, but hearing the chief's words made her pause. Greg had made a serious mistake, one that humiliated her and exposed deep flaws in the department's culture. Still, part of her wondered if firing him would actually solve anything, or if it was just a convenient way for the department to distance itself from the problem. This isn't just about Ma, Dana said softly, her voice laced with conviction. This is about the way we train our officers, the way we address or fail to address bias. Firing him won't fix that. Marshall nodded slowly, contemplating her words. You're right. But we have to do something to show the public we're taking this seriously. If we don't, this department will lose what little credibility it has left. Dana stared at her desk, her mind racing. She wanted accountability, but not just for Greg Ma. She wanted real change. Reforms that would tackle the systemic issues that had led to this point. Yet, she knew how the department worked. The people in charge cared more about managing optics than making meaningful changes. The mayor would want a quick fix, something to quell the protests. But Dana wasn't interested in quick fixes. What about the reforms I've been pushing for? Dana asked, her voice steady. The bias training, the revised arrest protocols. We've been talking about these changes for months, but they keep getting delayed. Marshall sighed, leaning back in his chair. I know, and I agree with you, those reforms are necessary, but the department's resources are stretched thin as it is. Implementing new training programs takes time, money, and manpower. Right now, we're under a lot of pressure from the top to contain this situation. Dana clenched her fists under the desk, frustration simmering. The same excuses, the same bureaucratic hurdles. She had heard them for years and was tired of it. The department always seemed to find the money for new equipment, tactical gear, or public relations campaigns. But when it came to addressing the root issues, bias, inequality, accountability, there was always some reason why things couldn't move forward. I'm not asking for miracles, Dana said sharply, her voice cutting through the tension. But we need to start somewhere. If we don't, what happened to me is going to keep happening to others, to civilians who don't have the rank or the platform to speak out. Marshall's eyes softened slightly, and for the first time, Dana saw a flicker of empathy. I hear you, Dana, I do, and I'll support you in pushing for those reforms. But you have to understand there's going to be resistance, not just from the higher-ups, but from within the department. A lot of people don't want to admit we have a problem. I'm not afraid of resistance, Dana replied firmly. I'm afraid of doing nothing. Marshall nodded, though his expression remained grave. All right, let's take this one step at a time. The mayor's office is going to release a statement soon, and they'll likely announce the independent investigation. That'll buy us some time, but we need to be ready. I want you to put together a proposal for the reforms you've been advocating for. We'll push it through, but we need to be strategic about it. A small glimmer of hope sparked in Dana, though it was tempered by the knowledge of how slow and grueling the process would be. Still, it was something. It was a start. I'll have the proposal ready by the end of the week, Dana said, her voice resolute. Good. Marshall stood, his expression still serious but less guarded than before. And Dana, take care of yourself. This isn't going to be easy, and there's going to be a lot of scrutiny on you. But you're one of the best officers we have, and I don't want to lose you. Dana looked up at him, her eyes hard but appreciative. I'm not going anywhere, Chief. Not until we get this right. Marshall gave her a small nod before turning and leaving the office, closing the door softly behind him. As soon as he was gone, Dana let out a long breath, leaning back in her chair. The weight of the conversation, the situation, everything that had happened pressed down on her, but she refused to let it crush her. She had come too far, fought too hard to back down now. Her phone buzzed again, and this time she picked it up, swiping the screen to read Emma's message. For a moment she considered calling her, hearing Emma's voice, finding some comfort in the middle of all this chaos. But she hesitated. Emma had always been supportive, but Dana knew this was something she had to face on her own, at least for now. She typed a quick response. I'm okay, just a lot going on. I'll see you later tonight. As she put the phone down, Dana stared at the blank report on her computer screen. There was so much to do, so much to think about, but she knew she had to focus. The reforms needed to happen. The reforms Dana had been pushing for were now more crucial than ever, and she couldn't afford to lose focus. As she began typing, the rhythmic clatter of the keyboard filled the silence of her office. Outside, the protests surged, the voices of the crowd growing louder and more insistent, demanding change, demanding justice. Dana knew she had to be part of that change. She had to use her position, her influence to push for something better, something that would ensure what had happened to her would never happen again to anyone. She worked late into the night, her determination fueling her, keeping her focused. The events of the past day had shaken her, but they had also ignited a fire within her, a fire that she wasn't going to let die out, not until the job was done, not until the department she had devoted her life to was a place she could truly be proud of. If that meant fighting every step of the way, then so be it. Dana Wells wasn't one to back down from a fight, now or ever. The next day, Dana sat at the press conference table, her back straight, hands clasped together in front of her. The room was packed with reporters, their faces a mix of curiosity and determination, eager to capture the day's story. Cameras flashed intermittently, their bright lights cutting through the dimness of the large conference room. The air was thick with tension, anticipation buzzing like an electric current through the crowd. To Dana's right sat Chief Marshall, his face a stern mask of authority, though she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. To her left was the mayor, a man more concerned with political survival than justice, his expression carefully neutral. Other senior officials and department heads flanked them on either side, presenting a united front meant to project stability and control in the face of the brewing storm. Outside the precinct, the protest had swelled in size and intensity. Hundreds of voices now rose in unison, demanding accountability and change. The chants echoed faintly through the walls, a constant reminder that this wasn't just a press conference, it was a reckoning for the entire police department. Dana felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was her chance to speak, to address what had happened, and to push for the changes she knew were desperately needed. But the stakes were high. One wrong word, one misstep, and the situation could spiral further out of control. The department's reputation, her career, and the community's trust were all on the line. The mayor was the first to speak, his voice calm and measured, the practiced tone of a politician who had weathered many storms. "Good afternoon," he began, his eyes sweeping across the room. "Thank you all for coming. We are here today to address the incident that occurred 2 days ago involving Captain Dana Wells. As many of you are aware, Captain Wells was mistakenly arrested by one of our officers during a routine patrol. This incident has understandably caused a great deal of concern, both within our community and beyond." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Let me be clear. What happened was unacceptable. We are committed to ensuring that this kind of incident does not happen again. To that end, we have launched an independent investigation into the matter. This investigation will be thorough, and we will hold those responsible accountable for their actions." Dana listened to the mayor's words, her expression neutral. She knew this was the city's attempt to control the narrative, to reassure the public that everything was under control, that they were taking the right steps. But she also knew that words alone weren't enough. The people outside weren't calling for an investigation. They were calling for real, tangible change. That was what Dana was here to push for. The mayor finished, and Chief Marshall stepped up to the microphone. "I want to echo the mayor's sentiments," Marshall began, his voice gravelly but clear. "Captain Wells is one of our most dedicated and respected officers. The fact that this happened to her is deeply troubling, and it highlights issues within our department that we must address." Marshall glanced at Dana, and she gave him a small nod, acknowledging his support. He continued, "As the investigation proceeds, we will also be reviewing our current protocols and training programs. It is imperative that our officers are equipped with the knowledge and skills to avoid situations like this in the future. We owe that to our community and to the men and women who serve it." When Marshall finished, the room fell into a brief, tense silence. All eyes turned to Dana. This was her moment. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and leaned forward slightly, her gaze sweeping across the room. The camera lights were bright, almost blinding, but she focused on the faces behind them. The reporters, the officials, the community leaders who had gathered to hear what she had to say. "Thank you," Dana began, her voice calm and steady. "I want to start by saying that what happened to me was not just a mistake. It was a symptom of a much larger problem within our police department, and frankly, within law enforcement as a whole. This isn't just about one officer making an error in judgment. This is about the systemic issues that allowed that error to happen in the first place." The room remained silent, the tension palpable as the reporters leaned in, pens and recorders at the ready. Dana felt the weight of her words, the responsibility of speaking out, but she pressed on. "I have spent my career working to address these issues: bias, inequality, the breakdown of trust between the police and the communities we serve. I've seen firsthand how these problems affect not just the people we've sworn to protect, but also the officers who are trying to do their jobs. And let me be clear, this is not a problem that can be solved with a few quick fixes or public statements. It requires real, meaningful change." She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. "The independent investigation that's been announced is a good first step, but it's just that, a first step. What we need is a comprehensive approach to reform. We need to overhaul our training programs to ensure that every officer is equipped to make sound decisions in the field. We need to implement new protocols that address the biases that too often influence these decisions, and we need to hold ourselves accountable when we fall short." The cameras flashed as she spoke, capturing every word, every gesture. Dana could see the reporters jotting down notes, their expressions serious and intent. She knew that what she was saying would be scrutinized, dissected and analyzed by the public, by her colleagues, and by the people in power. But she didn't care. This was her truth, and it needed to be said. There are those who might say that we should just move on from this, that we should focus on the positive and not dwell on mistakes. But I can't do that. We can't do that. Ignoring the problem doesn't make it go away. It only allows it to fester, to grow. And if we don't confront it head-on, then we're complicit in allowing it to continue. Dana felt a surge of emotion rise within her, but she kept her voice steady, controlled. She had to remain composed, even as the passion for the change she sought burned within her. "I love this department," she said, her voice softening slightly. "I've dedicated my life to it because I believe in the work we do. I believe in the people who serve alongside me. But I also believe that we can be better. We have to be better, not just for ourselves, but for the communities we serve, for the people who rely on us to protect them, to treat them with dignity and respect." She glanced at the mayor, who was watching her carefully, his expression unreadable. Then she turned back to the reporters, to the cameras that were broadcasting her words to the world beyond the room. "I'm asking for more than just an investigation," Dana said, her voice firm. "I'm asking for a commitment to real reform, to addressing the deep-seated issues that have plagued our department for far too long. I'm asking for the courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult, even when it means facing uncomfortable truths. Because that's the only way we're going to build the kind of department that our community deserves." The room was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioning and the clicking of cameras. Dana could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her, waiting for her next move, her next words. "I'm not here to point fingers or to assign blame," she continued, her tone steady. "But I am here to demand accountability. And I'm here to demand that we take this moment, this difficult, painful moment, and use it as an opportunity to grow, to learn, and to make the changes that are so desperately needed." Dana could see the expressions of the people around the table, the mayor, the chief, the other officials. Some looked supportive, others wary, but all seemed to understand the gravity of what she was saying. She took one final breath and finished her statement. "This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. It's about the kind of police department we want to be, the kind of legacy we want to leave. We have a choice right now to do the right thing. Let's not waste it." With that, Dana leaned back in her chair, her heart pounding in her chest, in her. The room remained silent for a few moments longer, as if everyone was processing what had just been said. Then the reporters began to murmur among themselves, the sound of scribbling pens and clicking keyboards filling the air. The mayor cleared his throat, clearly eager to regain control of the narrative. "Thank you, Captain Wells, for your powerful words. We appreciate your dedication to this department and your commitment to positive change. As we move forward, we will be working closely with Captain Wells and other leaders in our community to ensure that these issues are addressed and that our department becomes stronger as a result." The reporters began to raise their hands, eager to ask questions, but before the mayor could call on any of them, Chief Marshal leaned forward to speak into the microphone. "We'll be taking questions shortly, but I want to reiterate something Captain Wells just said. This is an opportunity for us to grow as a department. We recognize that change is necessary, and we are committed to making that change happen. We ask for the public's patience and trust as we navigate this process, and we pledge to be transparent and accountable every step of the way." Dana could feel the tension in the room easing slightly, though the undercurrent of urgency remained. The press conference would continue, with reporters asking questions, seeking more information, trying to probe deeper into the issues at hand. But Dana had said what she needed to say. She had made her position clear. As the mayor and the chief began fielding questions from the reporters, Dana sat back, her mind already shifting to the next steps. She knew that the real work was only just beginning. The press conference was just the start of a long and difficult process, one that would require persistence, determination, and most importantly, action. After the press conference ended, Dana stood up, shaking hands with the mayor and the chief as they exchanged polite words, but she could sense the underlying tension, the unspoken concerns that lingered between them. The mayor in particular seemed wary, as if unsure how Dana's strong stance would play out in the court of public opinion. But she didn't care about that. What mattered to her was that the right thing was done, regardless of the political fallout. As Dana made her way out of the conference room, she was approached by several reporters, their questions coming at her in rapid succession. But she politely declined to answer, telling them that everything she had to say was already on the record. She had no interest in getting drawn into a media circus. Her focus was on the work that needed to be done. Once she was outside, she was greeted by the sight of the continuing protest. The crowd had grown even larger, spilling out into the streets, their voices rising in a chorus of demands for justice, accountability, and change. Dana felt a surge of emotion as she looked out at the faces in the crowd, people of all ages, races, and backgrounds, united by a common cause. One of the protesters, a young woman with a handmade sign that read "Justice for All," caught her eye. Dana's eyes locked with the protesters, and for a brief moment there was a connection, a silent understanding that they were both fighting for the same thing. The woman nodded at her, a gesture of solidarity, and Dana nodded back. As she walked past the barricades, a few protesters recognized her, and she heard a smattering of applause and shouts of encouragement. It wasn't the usual reaction she received as a police officer, and it took her by surprise, but she appreciated it. It reminded her that despite everything, there were people out there who believed in her, who supported the changes she was advocating for. Dana made her way to her car, the noise of the protest fading slightly as she closed the door behind her. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to center herself. The day had been long and exhausting, but she knew there was still much to do. Her phone buzzed with a new message and she glanced down to see a text from Emma. "You were amazing today. So proud of you. Dinner at home tonight?" Dana smiled for the first time in what felt like days. She quickly typed back a response. "Thanks, I'd love that. See you soon." "See you." As she started the car and pulled away from the precinct, Dana felt a sense of resolve settle over her. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and obstacles, but she was ready. She had made her stand, and now it was time to back up her words with action. She thought about the proposal she had promised the chief, the reforms that needed to be put in place, the conversations that would need to happen with the rank and file, the union, and the community leaders. It was going to be a battle, but it was one she was prepared to fight. The streets were still crowded with protesters as she drove through the city, their signs and chants a constant reminder of the urgency of the moment. Dana felt a mix of emotions, pride, determination, and a deep sense of responsibility. The people were counting on her and the department to do the right thing, and she wasn't going to let them down. As she pulled into her driveway and turned off the engine, Dana sat in the silence for a moment, letting the events of the day wash over her. She thought about what had happened, about what still needed to happen. There was a lot at stake, but she was ready to face it head on. She got out of the car and walked up to the front door, the weight of the day still on her shoulders, but tempered by the thought of home, of Emma, of a quiet dinner, and some much-needed rest. But even as she stepped inside, the work continued to churn in the back of her mind. Plans and strategies were forming, her resolve hardening. Dana Wells was ready for what came next. Whatever it took, she would see this through, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been wronged, for everyone who had ever lost faith in the system, for everyone who believed that real change was possible. She wouldn't rest until it was done. The weeks that followed the press conference were a whirlwind of activity, tension, and hard-fought progress. Dana found herself thrust into the center of a storm that showed no signs of abating. Every day brought new challenges, new meetings, and new confrontations, but she refused to back down. This was the fight she had been preparing for her entire career, and she was determined to see it through no matter the cost. The independent investigation into her wrongful arrest was well underway, with a team of external auditors poring over every detail of the incident. They were examining not only what had happened on the street that day, but also the underlying issues within the department that had allowed it to happen in the first place. Dana met with the investigators several times, providing her account of the events, her insights into the department's culture, and her recommendations for what needed to change. Each meeting was grueling, but she knew it was necessary. She wanted the investigation to be thorough, to leave no stone unturned. But while the investigation was an important step, Dana knew it wasn't enough on its own. The reforms she had long advocated for were now more critical than ever. She had worked tirelessly to draft a comprehensive proposal that addressed the systemic issues she had seen throughout her career, issues that had been laid bare by her own experience. The proposal included mandatory bias training for all officers, a complete overhaul of the department's arrest protocols, the implementation of community policing initiatives, and the establishment of an independent oversight committee to ensure accountability and transparency. Getting this proposal approved, however, was another battle entirely. Dana spent countless hours in meetings with the department's leadership, the police union, and city officials, negotiating, debating, and pushing for the changes she knew were necessary. It was exhausting work. The resistance she encountered was formidable. Some officers bristled at the idea of additional training, viewing it as an unnecessary burden or an insult to their professionalism. The union was particularly vocal in its opposition, arguing that the reforms would place undue pressure on officers and undermine their ability to do their jobs effectively. "We're out there risking our lives every day," one union representative had said during a particularly heated meeting. "And now you want to saddle us with more red tape, more hoops to jump through. This is going to make it harder for us to protect the community, not easier." Dana had listened to their concerns, understanding their perspective but remaining firm in her resolve. "This isn't about making your jobs harder," she had replied, her voice calm but unwavering. "It's about making sure that when you do your jobs, you're doing them right. It's about ensuring that everyone in this city, everyone, feels safe and respected, including our officers. These reforms aren't meant to punish you. They're meant to protect you, to protect the integrity of our department, and to build trust with the community we serve." But the resistance wasn't just internal. The mayor's office, while publicly supportive of the reforms, was cautious behind the scenes, wary of the political ramifications. Dana had several tense conversations with the mayor and his aides, who were concerned about the potential backlash from certain segments of the electorate, particularly those who viewed any criticism of the police as unpatriotic or anti-law enforcement. "The optics of this are tricky," the mayor had said during one meeting. "We need to be careful how we frame this. We can't afford to alienate our base." Dana had felt a surge of frustration at his words. "This isn't about optics," she had shot back. "This is about doing what's right. We can't keep playing politics with people's lives. The community is demanding change, and we have a responsibility to deliver that change. If we don't, we're going to lose whatever trust we have left." The mayor had looked at her for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he sighed and nodded. "All right, Dana. You have my support. But we need to be smart about this. We need to bring people along with us, not push them away." With the mayor's tentative backing, Dana pressed forward. She spent her days in a relentless cycle of meetings, drafting and redrafting her proposal, responding to feedback, and building coalitions with community leaders, activists, and other stakeholders who were equally committed to seeing the reforms through. It was exhausting work, both physically and emotionally, but Dana felt a renewed sense of purpose with each small victory. Yet despite the progress being made on the policy front, the personal toll was becoming harder to ignore. Dana had always been good at compartmentalizing her emotions, keeping her work life separate from her personal life. But the events of the past few weeks had blurred those lines. The stress, the pressure, the constant scrutiny. It was all beginning to take a toll on her. At home, Emma could see the strain Dana was under, even if Dana tried to hide it. She would come home late, exhausted, often falling asleep on the couch before dinner was even ready. Emma, ever supportive, did her best to be there for her, to provide a safe space where Dana could decompress and escape from the chaos of her day-to-day life. But even Emma knew there was only so much she could do. One evening, after another long day of meetings, Dana came home to find Emma waiting for her with a concerned look on her face. The house was quiet, save for the faint sound of jazz playing softly in the background. Dana dropped her bag by the door and let out a weary sigh. You look exhausted, Emma said gently, coming over to give her a hug. You need to take a break, Dana. You can't keep going like this. Dana leaned into the embrace, closing her eyes for a moment. The warmth and comfort of Emma's arms were a welcome relief from the tension that had been building up inside her. I can't stop now, she murmured. There's too much at stake. Emma pulled back slightly, looking into Dana's eyes. I know, but you're only human. You need to rest. You can't pour from an empty cup, remember? Dana smiled faintly at the familiar phrase, one Emma had said to her many times before. I know you're right, she admitted, but I can't afford to slow down. Not with everything that's happening. Emma took her hand and led her to the couch, where they both sat down. Dana, you're doing everything you can, more than anyone could ask for. But you're no good to anyone if you burn out. You need to take care of yourself too. Dana looked down at their intertwined hands, feeling the weight of Emma's words. She knew she was pushing herself to the limit, but she couldn't shake the feeling that if she let up even for a moment, everything she had worked for would slip through her fingers. I feel like I'm carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders, Dana confessed, her voice trembling slightly. There's so much pressure, so many people counting on me. I can't let them down. Emma squeezed her hand, her voice soft but firm. You're not alone in this, Dana. You have people who believe in you, who are standing with you, but you have to let them help you. You don't have to carry all of this by yourself. Dana felt a lump form in her throat as she looked at Emma, the love and concern in her eyes almost overwhelming. I don't know what I'd do without you, Dana whispered, her voice breaking. You'll never have to find out, Emma replied, pulling her into another hug. I'm here for you, no matter what. But promise me you'll take care of yourself. You're no good to anyone if you're running on empty. Dana nodded, feeling the tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She hated showing vulnerability, hated admitting that she couldn't do it all on her own. But with Emma, she didn't have to pretend to be strong all the time. With Emma, she could let her guard down, even if just for a little while. I promise, Dana said softly, leaning her head on Emma's shoulder. I'll try to take better care of myself. They sat there in silence for a long time. The weight of the world momentarily lifted as they simply held each other. Dana knew that tomorrow would bring another round of battles, another day of fighting for the changes she believed in. But for now, she allowed herself to be present in this moment, to find comfort in Emma's embrace, to gather the strength she would need to keep going. The next morning, Dana woke up feeling slightly more rested, though the ever-present weight of her responsibilities was still there. She had a full day ahead of her, including a crucial meeting with the police union to finalize the details of the reform proposal. It was a meeting she had been dreading, knowing that the union was still resistant to many of the changes she was pushing for, but she also knew that this was a battle she had to win. When she arrived at the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. The protests outside had continued, though they had started to dwindle in size as the days went on. The public's attention was shifting to other issues, other scandals, but Dana knew that the work she was doing now would have lasting consequences long after the media had moved on. The meeting with the union was scheduled for mid-morning, and as the time approached, Dana felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. She had always prided herself on her ability to remain calm and composed in high-pressure situations. But this was different. This wasn't just about winning an argument or negotiating a contract. This was about the future of the department, about whether or not the reforms she had fought so hard for would actually come to fruition. The conference room where the meeting was being held was already filled with people when Dana arrived. The union representatives sat on one side of the table, their expressions guarded and wary. On the other side were the department's leadership, including Chief Marshall, who gave Dana a small nod as she took her seat. The tension in the room was palpable as the meeting began. The union representatives wasted no time in voicing their concerns, their arguments familiar to Dana by now. We understand the need for reform, one of the union leaders said, his tone measured but firm. But these changes you're proposing, mandatory bias training, revised arrest protocols, independent oversight, are going to put a huge strain on our officers. They're already stretched thin as it is. Adding more requirements is only going to make their jobs harder. Dana listened, bracing herself for the challenges ahead, knowing this would be another uphill battle, but one she had to win. Dana listened patiently, waiting for her turn to respond. When it came, she spoke with the same calm authority that had carried her through many difficult situations in the past. "I understand your concerns," she began, her voice steady, "but we can't afford to keep doing things the way we've always done them. The public's trust in us is eroding, and if we don't address the issues that are causing that erosion, we're going to lose that trust entirely. And once it's gone, it's almost impossible to get back." One of the union leaders leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "And you think these reforms are going to fix that? You think a few training sessions and new protocols are going to solve all our problems?" Dana met his gaze evenly. "No, I don't think they'll solve everything. But I do think they're a necessary first step. We have to start somewhere. We have to show the community that we're serious about making changes, that we're willing to hold ourselves accountable. If we don't, then we're just reinforcing the belief that we're part of the problem, not the solution." The room fell silent as the union representatives considered her words. Dana could see the reluctance in their eyes, the deep-seated resistance to change. But she also saw something else, a flicker of understanding, a recognition that something needed to be done, even if they didn't fully agree with her methods. The conversation continued, with both sides making their arguments, negotiating the details of the proposal, searching for common ground. It was a long and difficult process, marked by moments of tension and frustration, but Dana refused to give up. She knew this was her chance to make a real difference, to push through the changes that were desperately needed. By the end of the meeting, they had reached a tentative agreement. The union had agreed to support the reforms, though some concessions and compromises were made, ones Dana wasn't entirely happy with. Still, it was a start. It was progress, and something she could build on. As the meeting adjourned, Chief Marshal pulled Dana aside. "You did good in there," he said, his voice gruff but approving. "I know this wasn't easy, but you held your ground." Dana nodded, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. "Thank you, Chief. I just hope it's enough." Marshall gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "It's a start, and sometimes that's all we can ask for." Dana left the conference room with a sense of accomplishment, tempered by the knowledge that there was still much work to be done. The reforms were just the beginning. The real challenge would be implementing them, making sure they were followed, and ensuring they had the impact she knew they could. The next few weeks were consumed with the rollout of the reforms. Dana worked tirelessly with her team to implement the new training programs, revise the department's protocols, and establish the Independent Oversight Committee. It was grueling work, but Dana threw herself into it wholeheartedly. The reaction from the rank and file was mixed. Some officers embraced the changes, recognizing the need and appreciating the leadership Dana was showing. Others were more resistant, grumbling about the added requirements, extra scrutiny, and the shift in department culture. Dana made a point to visit as many precincts as she could, meeting with officers, answering their questions, and addressing their concerns. She knew that for the reforms to succeed, she needed buy-in from the people on the ground, those who would be most directly affected. During one such visit, Dana found herself in a heated discussion with a group of officers who were particularly skeptical of the new bias training. "This feels like a punishment," one officer said, arms crossed over his chest. "Like we're all being blamed for what happened." Dana shook her head, her voice firm but understanding. "This isn't about blame. It's about making sure we're all doing our jobs to the best of our abilities. Bias, whether conscious or unconscious, affects how we interact with the public, how we make decisions. This training is about recognizing those biases and learning how to counteract them. It's about being better officers, better public servants." Another officer spoke up, her tone more conciliatory. I get that, but some of us feel like we're being singled out, like the department doesn't trust us to do our jobs. Dana looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each officer. I know it might feel that way, but that's not the intent. This is about building trust, both within the department and with the community. It's about making sure that when we put on this uniform, we're representing the best of what this department can be. And that starts with us, right here, right now. There was a long pause as the officers considered her words. Dana could see the uncertainty in their faces, the hesitation, but also a willingness to listen, to give the new programs a chance. It wasn't an easy sell, but Dana knew that change never was. It required patience, persistence, and the courage to have difficult conversations. As she left the precinct that day, Dana felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was long, and there would be more challenges, more resistance. But she was making progress one step at a time, and that was enough to keep her going. At home, Emma continued to be a source of strength and support, helping Dana navigate the ups and downs of her work, providing a safe space where she could relax and recharge. They spent their evenings together, talking about their days, cooking dinner, watching movies, and finding small moments of joy in the midst of the chaos. One night, after a particularly long day, Dana came home to a surprise. The living room was filled with candles, soft music playing in the background, and a delicious meal waiting on the table. "What's all this?" Dana asked, a smile breaking across her face as she took in the scene. Emma grinned, pulling her into a hug. "You've been working so hard, and I wanted to do something special for you. You deserve it." Dana felt a rush of gratitude and love as she looked at Emma, her heart swelling with emotion. "You're amazing, you know that?" Emma laughed, kissing her softly on the lips. "And don't you forget it." They spent the evening together, talking, laughing, and enjoying each other's company. For a few hours, the weight of the world lifted, and Dana allowed herself to simply be present in the moment, grateful for the love and support that helped her keep going. Dana allowed herself to forget about the pressures of work and the challenges that lay ahead, and simply be present in the moment. As they sat on the couch later that night watching a movie, Dana rested her head on Emma's shoulder, feeling a sense of peace that had been elusive in recent weeks. "I couldn't do this without you," Dana said softly, her voice filled with sincerity. Emma stroked her hair gently, her voice warm and reassuring. "And you'll never have to. I'm with you every step of the way." Dana closed her eyes, letting the comfort of Emma's words wash over her. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, that the fight for change was far from over, but she also knew she wasn't alone in that fight. She had allies, supporters, people who believed in her and in the work she was doing. With them by her side, she knew she could face whatever challenges came her way. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the reforms Dana had fought for began to take root within the department. The new training programs were rolled out, officers began to adapt to the revised protocols, and the Independent Oversight Committee started its work. There were still moments of resistance, still challenges to overcome, but Dana remained steadfast in her commitment to seeing the changes through. She understood that true reform was a long and difficult process, one that required persistence, resilience, and the willingness to keep pushing forward, even when obstacles seemed insurmountable. But as Dana looked back on everything that had happened, from her wrongful arrest to the press conferences, negotiations, and implementation of the reforms, she felt a deep sense of pride. She had stood up for what was right, even when it was difficult, even when it would have been easier to stay silent. Dana had used her position and influence to make a real difference. She knew the work wasn't over. It would never be over as long as there were injustices to fight and wrongs to right. But she was ready for that fight, ready to continue the work she had started. That was who Dana Wells was, a fighter, a leader, and a woman who would never stop striving for a better, more just world. And with the support of her loved ones, her colleagues, and her community, she knew she could make that world a reality.